Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. Ah, quanto a dir qual era è cosa dura, esta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte che nel pensier rinnova la paura. Tanta è amara che poco è più morte. Ma per trattar del ben ch'io vi trovai, dirò dell'altre cose ch'ivo scorte. Io non so ben ridir com'io ventrai, tant'era pien di sonno in su quel punto che la verace via abbandonai. Ma poi chi fui al piè d'un colle giunto, là dove terminava quella valle che m'avea di paura il cor compunto, guardai in alto e vidi le sue spalle vestite già de raggi del pianeta che mena dritto altrui per ogni calle. Allor fu la paura un poco queta che nel lago del cor m'era durata la notte ch'i passai con tanta pieta. E come quei che con lena affannata, uscito fuor del pelago alla riva, si volge all'acqua perigliosa e guata, così l'animo mio ch'ancor fuggiva si volse a retro a rimirar lo passo che non lasciò giamai persona viva.
That was a dramatic reading of the first opening canto of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. It is, as recited, a romantic and alluring passage, but Italians of Dante's time would have called it vulgar. A politician in scorned exile by circumstance, Dante's cultural education and desire for a united Italy would turn him into the celebrated father of the Italian language itself. The birth date of Dante, full name Durante di Alighiero degli Alighieri, is unknown, as it was never properly recorded by the man himself or archived, although certain allusions to astrology in the Divine Comedy, where the main character is an allegorical insertion of the poet himself, provide some hints that he was born sometime around May to June 1265 CE, as inferred in Cantos 22. I have come to the point on the wheel where the horizon gives birth at sunset to the twin heaven, and the star of love is kept from us by the sun's ray that straddles her so traversely that she is veiled, and that planet that straightens the frost shows itself to us entirely, along the great arc where each of the seven casts a little shadow. Now, this might seem like a whole lot of flowery nonsense to those who lack familiarity with astrology, so me, but I've been informed by smarter people that this quote acts as a detailed description of this state's night sky, which can be tracked through the historical record. I'd highly suggest fans of numerology and cryptology to look the rest up themselves, because Dante's methods of hiding meaningful information in numbers and imagery is intricate and ingenious, and I'm nowhere near qualified enough to explain it. Not much is known about Dante's early education or personal life, and most of what we do think we know is inferred. We believe he studied at home because it was common for the children of prominent families like Dante's to receive home tutorship, and his later study of Tuscan literature probably came from his interactions with, if not outright enrollment in, the Sicilian school, which is one of the largest trans-Italian cultural groups of the period. This is also where he likely picked up his fascination with Occitan poetry of the troubadours, who were considered to be the stewards of lower class common culture as opposed to the Latin and Greek high culture of the era. What we do know, because he tells us this directly in his La Vita Nuova poem, is that he met the then 8-year-old Beatrice Bortinari at the age of 9. This discovery of his first love was enlightening to the young poet, and Beatrice would become both a crush and muse over the course of his entire career, which I think is simply precious. Dante, however, never knew Beatrice well, and in truth they only met twice. Any romantic feelings either had for the other would remain unresolved. Inspired by this distant youthful yearning, Dante began work writing in what would be celebrated as the dolce stile nuovo, or sweet new style, a new type of Italian poetry that focused on courtly love, metaphor, and aesthetic prose. In many of these poems, Beatrice is depicted by Dante as semi-divine, watching over him constantly, and this goes slightly too far for my taste. This loving obsession would remain with Dante even after he married Gemma Donati in 1285. It was Beatrice's death in 1290 that pushed Dante into Latin studies, where he sought the works of Boethius's Consultations and Cicero's De Amicitia for guidance in his grief. Given new purpose by philosophy, Dante devoted himself full-time to religious schools like the Dominican in Santa Maria Novella. Here he first cut his political teeth, becoming a mediator between Franciscan and Dominican orders of the school. Dante's life would be heavily weighed on by politics, as he, like most wealthy Florentines of his day, was directly involved in the city's Guelph-Ghibelline conflict. He fought in the Battle of Camperdino with the Guelphs, and later escorted Charles Agno, a prominent grandson of Charles I of Naples, around Florence, earning much political favor. After defeating the Ghibellines, the Guelphs divided into two factions, the Whites and the Blacks. The Blacks supported papal influence on the city, while the Whites sought greater independence from Rome. To make things short, the Whites won over Florence, but were quashed by the Blacks through the conquest of Charles de Valois, acting on direct orders from the Pope. During this time, Dante was exiled to Rome, and although he tried to participate in several white insurrections, these all failed due to treachery. Growing bitter at his enemies and disgusted with the infighting amongst its own faction, Dante retreated further into philosophy and literature. In Rome, he began work on his Divine Comedy, as much a work of art as it was a blatant condemnation of his enemies and Florence's own self-destruction. His bitterness was such that, when Henry VII, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, threatened to invade Italy, Dante actually spurred him on, writing to him with a personal list of enemies he could take out if only His Majesty would be so kind. This was also when he wrote De Monarchia, an essay that deconstructed the weaknesses of republics and proposed the moral legitimacy of Henry VII's universal monarchy over all of Italy. Although Henry did manage to drive the Black Gulfs from Florence, he failed to beat the common cold, dying of a fever in 1313, leaving Dante in permanent exile. There would, however, be a few more opportunities for him to return, but each one fell through as Dante was either too poor to afford the city's fee for amnesty or too prideful to want it. Describing his life in exile, he recites the following passage from Paradiso 17. You shall leave everything you love most. This is the arrow that the bow of exile shoots first. You are to know the bitter taste of others' bread, how salty it is, and know how hard a path it is for one who goes ascending and descending others' stairs. About the possibility of returning in his lifetime, he said, if it ever came to pass that the sacred poem to which both heaven and earth have set their hand, so as to have made me lean for many years, should overcome the cruelty that bars me from the fair sheepfold where I slept as a lamb, an enemy to the wolves that make war on it, with another voice now, and other fleece, I shall return a poet, and at the font of my baptism take the laurel crown. When one says the father of language, people tend to think of names like Shakespeare or Pushkin, juggernauts of their native tongue who almost single-handedly define their people's literature and artistic voice through the novel creation of new words, methods of expression, and styles of prose. Dante's effect on Italian has been similar, if not as drastic, on the structures of language itself as other literary founders. Linguist Dio di Moro claimed that in the beginning of the 1300s, 60% of the essential vocabulary of Italian, the 2,000 words used in everyday Italian life, already existed in colloquial use. By the end of the century, Dante had left us with a lexicon that included nearly 90% of the modern essential vocabulary. Unlike his fellow spiritual fathers of the language, Dante's most radical contribution wasn't in the production of new vocabulary or grammar, but the acknowledgement that it was worthy of literary consideration at all. The common tongue at the end of the Roman era was Latin. It is a mistake to think, as we often do today, that Latin of Romans was a monolithic language. The Romans held a wide variety of dialects distinct in region and class, much as we do today, and they differentiated the standard Latin of patricians and the educated from the Sirmo Vulgaris, directly translated to common speech. Despite the emotional impact that words like vulgar has on us today, it really was just a description of common dialect. When the empire fell and Rome ceased to be a unified cultural and political authority, Germanic, Arabic, and Slavic speaking peoples gradually transformed Italy's vulgar Latin into an entirely distinct language, the group known today as the Romance languages. Dante's native tongue, Florentine Tuscan, was one of these Romance languages, and it, together with other popular Italian languages like Corsican, Sicilian, Catalan, Venetian, and Ligurian, form the complex patchwork of Italian dialects. Unlike the politically and culturally united Rome of before, medieval Italy was fractured, split between major and distinct political powers. A culturally and linguistically unified Italy was an alien hope for Dante and his contemporaries. To give an idea of how divided Italy was, for a time, the Kingdom of Naples, which covered nearly the entire third of the country, was under the rule of the thoroughly French Angevin dynasty. Classical Latin was still in widespread use as a lingua franca of most of Europe, but it was no longer a colloquial, evolving language. Instead, it acted as a mediator of shared knowledge, culture, and tradition across Christendom, rather than as a language meant for everyday use. Despite some generous borrowing of vulgar Latin grammar and vocabulary, as well as the creation of new words meant to elaborate on Christian Semitic theology, Classical Latin remained conservative and carefully curated, save for minor adoptions of grammatical articles common in Romantic tongues, as seen in the word esse, which means to be, being replaced with habere, or to have. These changes were not widely popular with all scholars, and were even derided by prominent intellectual authorities like Thomas Aquinas and Archbishop William of Tyre for polluting the noble language of the Christian tradition. Dante, heavily inspired by his time studying the work and success of the troubadours in preserving, spreading, and elevating the Occitan languages, turned his attention towards his own Florentine. Perhaps spurred on by Italy's own fractured state in his exile, Dante began work on his De Vulgari Eloquentia, or On Eloquence in the Vernacular. This essay acted as something of a philosophical treatise on the relationship between Latin and the common languages, and became a manifesto of sorts for Dante's own search for what he deemed the illustrious vernacular, a vulgar tongue that could compete with and even supersede Latin as a vessel for important cultural and philosophical content. It is in this book that Dante first lays out his theory on what defines and makes common speech important. I declare that the vernacular language is that which we learn without any formal instruction, by imitating our nurses. There also exists another kind of language, at one removed from us, which the Romans called grammatica, or grammar. The Greeks, and some, but not all, other peoples, also have this secondary kind of language. Few, however, achieve complete fluency in it, since knowledge of its rules and theories can only be developed through dedication to a lengthy course of study. Of these two kinds of languages, the more noble is the vernacular, first, because it was the language originally used by the human race, second, because the whole world employs it, though with different pronunciations and using different words, and third, because it is natural to us, while the other is, in contrast, artificial. And this more noble kind of language is what I intend to discuss. I want to pause for a moment and highlight what Dante said about the natural aspect of vernacular. Through this course, I have read many different authors like Giunpa Lahiri, who all seem to be searching for authenticity in their writing, in order to reject what they see as artificial constructions in their expression. It is odd to me that even centuries ago, in a vastly different culture with vastly different values, centuries apart from us, that this longing for authenticity in the written word remains consistent. I don't have anything to add to that. I just thought it was interesting. After several passages discussing the theological meaning behind human language, which he describes as a God ordained necessity for rational animals who think separately from instinct, Dante makes his first argument for why it isn't just practical that one should prefer a natural tongue, but spiritually significant. Since human affairs are now carried on in so many different languages, so that many people are no better understood by others when they use words than when they do not, it behooves us to hunt for the language believed to have been used by the man who never had a mother nor drank her milk, the man who never saw either childhood nor maturity. In this, as in many other matters, Pietramala, now the modern isolated city of Quito, a place Dante and others use as an idyllic setting, is a great city indeed, the home of the greater part of the children of Adam. For whoever is so misguided as to think that the place of his birth is the most delightful spot under the sun, may also believe that his own language, his mother tongue that is preeminent among all others, and as a result he may believe that his language was also Adam's. Then Dante continues on to give a rather cosmopolitan view of the importance of linguistic diversity, managing to throw some shade along the way. To me, however, the whole world is a homeland, like the sea to a fish. Though I drank from the Arno before cutting my teeth, and loved Florence so much that, because I loved her, I suffer exile unjustly, and I will weigh the balance of my judgment more with reason than with sentiment. And although for my own enjoyment, rather for the satisfaction of my own desire, there is no more agreeable place on earth than Florence, yet when I turn the pages of the volumes of poets and other writers by whom the world is described as a whole and in its constituent parts, and when I reflect inwardly on the various location of places in the world and their relations to the two poles and the circle at the equator, I am convinced and firmly maintain that there are many regions and cities more noble and more delightful than Tuscany and Florence, where I was born and in which I am a citizen, and many nations and peoples who speak a more elegant and practical language than do the Italians. Dante's celebration of the many tongues of peoples is a noble gesture, but he begins to betray this sentiment of goodwill as he starts down the process of narrowing down his selection for what Italy's illustrious vernacular should be. First, he describes the deficiencies of Roman Latin, which we should remember is considered to be the educated and high tongue of the period. Let us begin by clearing the tangled bushes and brambles out of the wood. Accordingly, since the Romans believed that they should always receive preferential treatment, I shall begin this work of pruning or uprooting as only right with them, and I do so by declaring that they should not be taken into account in any dialectic work about effective use of the vernacular. For what the Romans speak is not so much a vernacular as a vile jargon, the ugliest of all the languages spoken in Italy, and this should come as no surprise, for they also stand out among all Italians for their ugliness of manners and their outward appearance. He then goes on to ride much of Italy's vernaculars, saying, and along with theirs I reject all languages spoken in the mountains and in the countryside, by people like those of Casentino and Frata, whose pronounced accent is always at such odds with that of city dwellers. As for the Sardinians, who are not Italian, but may be associated with Italians for our purposes, out they must go, because they alone seem to lack a vernacular of their own, instead imitating grammatica as apes do humans. In the end, out of all the cities and regions and peoples to consider, Dante settles on his Florentine Tuscan as the most illustrious, praising it as so outstanding, so lucid, so perfect and civilized, from among so many ugly words used by the Italians, so many convoluted constructions, so many defective formations, and so many barbarous pronunciations. And this to me is Dante's most interesting contribution to the course. Many other translingual authors made their mark in their outreach and exploration of language, but Dante's legacy has been largely the opposite. He might have been well educated and learned about languages, even finding a lot to admire in certain linguistic traditions outside his own, but he was, by his own words, something of a Florentine elitist. In opposition to the majority of authors whose learning turned them outwards, Dante's education and experience as an exile actually turned him inwards, towards further exaltation and admiration of the language of his home culture. In 1320, Dante would complete the Divine Comedy, a labor of nearly 12 years in the making since he first began it in 1302. Although his work was admired by all, and the comedy would become essential reading in Christendom, Dante would never live to see the impact that his writings would have on Italy and Europe, as he was struck with malaria the following year and died in 1321. Dante's post mortem legacy has almost single handedly redefined what Italian culture was for the rest of Europe, becoming such a household name that his beloved Florentine vernacular was often called Dante's language or Dante's Italian in the other Romance and Germanic languages. As he predicted, Sicily's influence would reign, and Florence would become synonymous with Italian literature and culture. He had succeeded in transforming the vulgar into the artistic. Despite this success, Italy would remain fractured for the next 540 years, until Italian unification in 1861. It wouldn't be until 1950 till Italy formally adopted a Tuscan-based nationalized language similar to Dante's own recommendation. Florence, meanwhile, continued to feel pretty bad about the whole exiling the greatest poet scandal, and managed to finally rescind the exile order in 2008.